Clara Bowman pressed one hand against the side of the stagecoach and stepped down into the dirt of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, all 240 pounds of a woman who had run clean out of places to disappear into. The warrant in her coat pocket had someone else's name on it. The bruises along her jaw were 4 days old. And the man waiting at the end of this road had posted a job advertisement that said simply, "Cook wanted. No questions asked." She should have known that was a lie. If this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell so you don't miss a single moment, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The advertisement had been folded so many times the paper was soft as cloth. Cook wanted. Callaway Ranch. Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory. Room and board provided. $50 monthly. No questions asked. Reply to H. Callaway. Clara had read it 17 times on the train from Kansas City. She'd read it again on the second stagecoach, and then the third, pressing her thumb against the words, "No questions asked," like they were a promise someone had made directly to her. She was 34 years old. She had $11 a cast iron skillet, wrapped in a flour sack, and a last name that wasn't hers anymore. The driver didn't help her with her trunk. He just pointed at a cluster of weathered buildings maybe 200 yards from where the road ended and said, "That's Callaway land." And then he was gone, leaving a wall of dust between her and the last moving thing she'd seen in 6 hours. Clara picked up her trunk by the handle. It was heavy. She was strong. She'd always been strong. Her mother had said it like it was an apology. Like all that strength in a girl's body was something that needed excusing. "You're a big girl, Clara. Strong as an ox, that one." She'd learned early that strong and valued were not the same word. She carried the trunk toward the main house and didn't stop when her boots sank in the mud. A man was coming out of the barn. He walked, the way men walked when they'd forgotten there was any reason to hurry. Shoulders forward, jaw set, eyes already measuring her before she got close enough to speak. He was somewhere around 40, lean the way hard work made a man lean, with sun-cracked skin and a hat so beaten it had given up any original shape. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her the way people had been looking at her whole life, like he was running a calculation she wasn't supposed to see. "You're the cook," he said. "I'm Clara Bowman." She set the trunk down and straightened up to her full height, which wasn't inconsiderable. "I answered your advertisement." "I can see that." His eyes moved to her trunk, then back to her face. "You got references. You said no questions asked." Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a smile. More like a man remembering he'd said a thing he hadn't entirely thought through. "I meant questions about your past. References are practical. Then, practically speaking, the woman I cooked for in Kansas City is not in a position to give them." Clara held his gaze. "She passed in February. I can tell you what I know how to make. You can decide from there." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind came through and pushed dust between them, and neither of them moved. "Hank Callaway," he said finally, and didn't offer his hand. "I know. It was on the advertisement. Breakfast is at 5:30, dinner at 6, lunch goes out to the field in a pail. You burn the bread, you're done. You cause trouble, you're done." He picked up her trunk before she could stop him. Not out of courtesy, she could tell, but out of efficiency, like he was moving a piece of equipment. "Kitchen's in back. You've got a room off it. Small." "Small is fine." "Stove needs work. I haven't had a cook in 4 months." "What happened to the last one?" He didn't answer that. He just walked toward the house and expected her to follow, which she did. The kitchen hit her the moment he opened the back door. That particular smell of a room that had been half used and half abandoned, grease-gone rancid flour left open to the air the ghost of 100 meals that hadn't been properly cleaned up after. Clara breathed through her mouth and said nothing. She'd worked in worse. "Supplies are in the root cellar," Hank said, setting her trunk by the door to the small room off the kitchen. "List is on the shelf. I need you feeding 3 people by tomorrow morning." "3. You and my daughters." His voice dropped 1 full degree in temperature. "Ruthie's 12, Dottie's 7. You don't discipline them. You don't question how I'm raising them. You cook and you keep the kitchen clean and you stay in your lane. Understood." Clara pulled off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. "Any dietary considerations?" "Anything they won't eat." "Dottie won't eat anything green. Don't try to change that." He paused at the doorway. "Ruthie will tell you she doesn't like you. That's not personal. She doesn't like anyone." "I can work with that. You say that now." He looked at her, really looked for the first time like he was seeing something past the surface calculation. "What made you come all the way to Wyoming for a cook's job?" "The distance," Clara said. He waited like he expected more. She gave him nothing. He left. Clara stood in the center of the wrecked kitchen and took a slow breath and started rolling up her sleeves. She had been cooking since she was 8 years old. Her grandmother's kitchen, her mother's kitchen, the boarding house kitchen in St. Louis where she'd worked at 16 for room and board and 30 cents a week, and then Gerald Marsh's kitchen, which was the last kitchen she intended to ever think about again. So she stopped the thought right there, the way you stop a door from swinging open by pressing your full weight against it. She found a broom. She found lye soap and a bucket. She found the root cellar and the supply list, and she understood immediately that whoever had been managing this household since the cook left had not been managing it so much as surviving it. She got to work. She was scrubbing the stove when she felt eyes on her. She didn't turn around right away. She'd learned to feel when she was being watched without making a production of noticing it. She finished the corner she was working on and then straightened up and turned around naturally like she'd just decided to. The girl in the doorway was maybe 7 years old, dark hair badly brushed, a dress that was clean but too small with the hem let down as far as it would go. She had her father's jaw and eyes so dark they were nearly black, and she was looking at Clara with the particular expression of a child who had learned that new people in the house meant something was about to change and change was not safe. "Hello," Clara said. She didn't move toward her. "I'm Clara. I'm going to be cooking your meals." The girl didn't speak. "Are you Dottie?" Still nothing, but she didn't leave either. "I'm making cornbread tonight," Clara said, turning back to the stove. "And beans with salt pork if I can find the salt pork, which I think I can. The cornbread will take about 40 minutes once the stove is ready. You're welcome to stay in here if you want, but you don't have to." She heard small feet on the floor. Not leaving. Staying. She kept working. She was halfway through sorting the flour barrel when the second one appeared. This girl was older 12, all sharp angles, and a mouth set in a line that said she'd already decided how this was going to go. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and looked at Clara the way her father had, except without any of the careful neutrality. This was open assessment, and the assessment was not favorable. "You're big," the girl said. "Ruthie." Dottie's voice was barely above a whisper, the first sound she'd made, and it was a warning to her sister. "I'm just saying what's true." Ruthie didn't move from the doorway. "Papa said you were the cook. I didn't picture someone your Ruthie Calloway." Hank's voice came from somewhere down the hall, sharp enough to carry through 2 walls. Ruthie's jaw tightened. She didn't apologize. She didn't look away from Clara either. Clara set down the flour scoop and looked at the girl directly. "You're right," she said. "I am big, always have been. Doesn't slow me down any. You want good cornbread tonight or not?" A beat of silence. "I want good cornbread," Dottie whispered. Ruthie looked at her sister, then back at Clara. Something moved across her face. Not warmth, nothing close to warmth, but a recalculation. "Fine," she said, and walked away. Dottie stayed. By the time the cornbread was in the oven, Dottie was sitting on the stool in the corner, watching Clara work with the focused attention of a child who had learned that watching was safer than participating. Clara narrated everything she did, not talking at the girl, just talking the way she'd always talked when she cooked, like the food needed the company. "Cornbread wants to be treated honest," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You put in what it needs, no more no less. It'll tell you when it's done it'll smell different kind of toasty and warm like something good just happened." Dottie blinked. How does something smell like it happened? Clara felt something open up in her chest. The girl had spoken in a full sentence, without seeming to realize it. "That's a real good question," she said like it was the most natural thing, and went back to stirring the beans. Dinner was quiet. Hank ate with the focus of a man who'd been running on hardtack and necessity for 4 months and had enough dignity not to show how hungry he actually was. Ruthie ate quickly, one eye on her father, one eye on Clara, like she was watching for something to go wrong. Dottie ate everything on her plate, including the beans, which surprised Hank enough that he looked up from his own bowl. He looked at Clara. She looked at her cornbread and said nothing. "Meal's good?" he said finally. "Thank you." "Better than good," Ruthie said like the words were pulled out of her against her will. Then she stood up and took her plate to the basin and disappeared without another word. Hank watched the doorway where his older daughter had been standing. Something crossed his face. Grief, Clara thought, but shaped like exhaustion. The kind that came from trying to hold everything together so long that you'd forgotten what it felt like not to be holding anything. "How long since their mother passed?" Clara asked. His eyes came back to her. Cold again instantly. "I don't discuss that." "Fair enough." She stood and began clearing the table. 2 years. He said it to the space in front of him, not to her. Beth died 2 years ago March. Fever. Took her in 5 days. A long pause. Dottie stopped talking much after that. Ruthie stopped. He closed his mouth. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Clara said quietly. She wasn't looking at him. She was stacking bowls. "She was 8, Dottie said from the doorway. They both turned. She was standing there in her nightgown, her dark eyes moving from her father to Clara and back. "When Mama died, Ruthie was 8, like me now. She says that's why she understands." "Dottie, it's time for bed." Hank's voice was gentle in a way that was clearly painful for him to access. "Papa." Dottie looked at Clara. "Is she staying?" "That's up to her." Dottie turned those dark eyes on Clara. "Are you staying?" Clara thought about the $11 in her coat pocket. She thought about the warrant with someone else's name on it. She thought about Gerald Marsh and what he'd said the last time she'd tried to leave. "I'll find you wherever you go. I always find what's mine." She thought about the bruises she was hiding under her long sleeves, fading now from purple to the yellow of old regret. "I'm staying," she said. Dottie nodded once very seriously and went to bed. Hank sat at the table for a moment longer. Then he stood, looked at Clara in a way that was hard to read, and said, "Kitchen light goes out at 9. You need anything from town, make a list and Walt will take you Thursday." "Who's Walt?" "My foreman. He'll find you tomorrow morning. Don't let him talk you into anything. He's friendly to a fault, and it costs him time he doesn't have." He was already in the doorway. "You need more wood for the stove. There's a pile on the north side of the barn." "Mr. Calloway." He stopped. "The salt pork in your root cellar has turned. I used the bacon ends instead. Tomorrow I'll need to know your budget for supplies before I make a list." A pause. "I'll write it down." "Thank you." He left. And Clara stood in the kitchen alone with the smell of her own cornbread and the sound of the stove clicking as it cooled, and let herself very quietly put both hands flat on the counter and breathe. She was 3,000 miles from Gerald Marsh. She was not safe. She knew she was not safe. A man like Gerald didn't lose things without making someone pay for the losing. But she was 3,000 miles away, and she had a locked door between her and the night, and tomorrow morning she was going to make biscuits. She fed the stove a piece of wood and went to bed. She woke at 4:30 to the sound of someone crying. Not loud. Not the kind of crying that wanted to be heard. The kind that happened when a person thought the walls were thick enough, small and muffled, coming from somewhere down the hall toward the girls' rooms. Clara lay still for a moment listening. It stopped. She gave it 5 minutes. It didn't start again. She got up and started the stove. She was elbow deep in biscuit dough when Dottie appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:15, eyes red-rimmed hair tangled, dragging a quilt behind her like a tail. "Couldn't sleep," the girl said. "Want to help?" Clara asked. Dottie crossed to the table and climbed onto the stool. Clara tore off a small piece of dough and set it in front of her. "Press it flat with your palm," she said. "Like this. Just your weight, you don't need to push, you just lean." Dottie pressed the dough with her small hand, watching it spread. "It's warm. Dough's always warm. It's alive in a way. There's yeast in it, tiny living things that eat the flour and make bubbles, and that's what makes it rise." Dottie looked at her. "You're not scared of it? Of dough? Of tiny living things you can't see?" Clara thought about that seriously, the way the question deserved. "No. I figure if something's working to make something else better, I don't need to be scared of it just because I can't see it happening." Dottie turned that over for a moment. Then she pressed another piece of dough flat. "Ruthie cried last night," she said. "She doesn't know I can hear her through the wall. She'd hate it if I told her." "Then don't tell her." "I won't." Dottie's hand stilled. "She's mad at you." "I know. She's mad at everyone who comes here because everyone leaves." The girl said it like she was reporting weather. Simple. Factual. Devastating. "The cook before you left after 6 weeks. The one before that lasted 11 days. Papa doesn't think people stay." "What do you think?" Clara asked. Dottie considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had been thinking about adult problems for 2 years. "I think some people leave because they want to," she said. "And some people leave because something makes them. Those are different." "That's a wise thing to know. Mama didn't want to leave." Her voice didn't break. It had the quality of something that had already broken and been carefully put back together. "She got sick. That's different. Ruthie knows that too, but she forgets sometimes when she's scared." Clara set down the biscuit she was shaping. She looked at this 7-year-old girl with the red eyes and the quilt and the pieces of pressed dough and felt something settle in her chest, like a stone, finding the bottom of still water. "I'm not going to leave because I want to," she said. Dottie looked at her. "I can't promise you nothing will ever make me," Clara continued, because she owed this child honesty more than she owed her comfort. "The world doesn't let us make that kind of promise, but I can tell you, I'm not going anywhere today, and tomorrow morning I'll be right here making something for breakfast, and we'll go from there." Dottie seemed to think about this for a long time. Then she reached over and pressed another piece of dough flat. "Okay," she said. Ruthie appeared at breakfast like a weather system. She came in, sat down, looked at the plate Clara put in front of her, and said nothing. The biscuits were golden, slightly crisp on the bottom, soft through the center. Clara had found a jar of honey in the back of the pantry and set it on the table without comment. Ruthie looked at the honey. She looked at the biscuits. She looked at Clara. "I'm not apologizing," she said. "I didn't ask you to," Clara said. "For what I said yesterday, about you being—" She stopped. "Big," Clara said pleasantly. "The word you're looking for is big. You can say it. It's just a description." Ruthie's chin went up. "It was rude." "It was honest. I can work with honest." Clara poured coffee for Hank and set it at his place. "Rude and honest aren't the same thing. You were both. The honest part I respected." Hank came in from outside, hat already on, and took his seat. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at the honey. He looked at Dottie, who had already eaten half her plate, and was watching Ruthie with bright eyes. "Morning," he said to no one in particular. "Morning," Ruthie said. She picked up a biscuit and split it open and spread honey on both halves and ate it in 4 bites. She didn't say it was good, but she took another one. Walt Greer found Clara at the root cellar at 9 o'clock, exactly the way Hank had described him. Big voice first, actual man second. "You must be the new cook." His voice bounced off every building on the property. "Lord Almighty, it smells like actual food in this house. You have no idea what we've been living on. Walt Greer, foreman, at your service, and I cannot tell you how grateful. Walt." Hank's voice from the barn. "Right, yes." Walt lowered himself from about 7 to a 4. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Bowman. I heard you need a supply list looked at." "I need to know what's available in town and what has to be freighted in and how long freight takes. 2 weeks from Denver. 3 if it's winter. Town's got basics. Pruitt's General has good stock. Nell Pruitt runs it, she's fair, and she doesn't cheat on weight. He leaned against the root cellar door. You thinking to do anything special with the kitchen? Last cook had some ideas but couldn't execute. One before that just survived. One before that. He stopped. What happened to her? Clara asked. Walt rubbed the back of his neck. She was kind to the girls, he said carefully. Dottie took to her something fierce. When she left, Dottie didn't eat solid food for 4 days. Hank had to... He shook his head. It was bad. He's particular about that now. Protective. You'll see. I already see, Clara said. She was pulling beets from the root cellar shelf when Walt said quieter, You got someone looking for you. Her hand stilled. I'm not asking to know your business, he said quickly. You watch the road. When a horse comes down from the ridge, you look before you let yourself breathe. I've seen that before. On people who are running from something. Clara pulled 2 more beets from the shelf and set them in her basket. What happened to the person you saw it in before? She got found, Walt said. Husband came. Sheriff in this county didn't do much because in this county the sheriff does what the money tells him. She left with the husband. A pause. Didn't look right when she left. Clara stood up straight and looked at Walt Greer directly. He was somewhere between 45 and 50, with a face that had been weathered into something honest. He held her gaze without flinching. I'm not going back, she said. Didn't figure you were. He picked up the basket. I'll carry this. And if anyone comes asking around town about a woman matching your description, Nell Pruitt has a long memory for who needs to know things and who doesn't. He started toward the house. That's just information. You can do with it what you like. Clara stood at the root cellar door and looked out at the ridge road, empty and white in the morning light, and did what she always did when the fear came up through the floor. She breathed. She went back to the kitchen. She had dinner to make. Ruthie found her at 3 in the afternoon. Clara was kneading bread dough at the table, the kind of work that required her full weight behind her arms, shoulders moving in long, even strokes. She heard Ruthie's boots on the floor and didn't stop what she was doing. Can I ask you something? Ruthie said. You can ask me anything. Ruthie sat down on the stool Dottie had claimed as hers that morning. She watched Clara work for a moment. Why do you cook your... She stopped herself this time before Clara had to. Smart enough to do something else, Clara supplied. Ruthie had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I cook because I'm good at it, Clara said, and because it's real. You put flour and water and a little patience into something, and it becomes a thing that feeds people. That's not nothing. Her hands pressed into the dough and folded it over. Why do you ask? Mama cooked, Ruthie said. Not like you. I mean, she cooked. But you cook like she struggled for it, like it means something. Everything means something if you let it. Ruthie was quiet for a moment. Then, she's talking more. Dottie. She talked at breakfast more than she has in... She stopped again, and this time it wasn't because she was editing herself. It was because the feeling was too big for the sentence. I noticed, Clara said. Don't think that means... Ruthie started, and her voice had gone to that hard, flat place again. Don't think that means anything about you staying or not staying, because people don't stay. And Dottie's going to get hurt again, and it's going to be... She cut off. Clara stopped kneading. She turned and looked at Ruthie Calloway, 12 years old, shoulders drawn up to her ears, jaw clenched against feelings she hadn't been given permission to have, and said nothing for a moment. You're doing a good job, Clara said. Ruthie blinked. Of what? Taking care of her. Of him. Of this whole house best you can. Clara turned back to the dough. That's a big thing for a 12-year-old to be carrying? Ruthie's throat moved. Somebody has to. That's true, Clara said. And somebody else is here now, so you don't have to carry it all alone. That's also true. Ruthie sat on the stool for a long time after that. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't leave. That night, Hank found Clara in the kitchen long after dinner was cleared, feeding starter she'd begun with a small portion of flour and water she'd saved out at noon. "What's that?" he asked from the doorway. "Sourdough starter. I need to build it up before I can bake sourdough properly. Takes a few days." She set the jar carefully on the shelf near the warm side of the stove. "It was my grandmother's recipe. She kept her starter alive for 30 years. He looked at the jar like it was something he hadn't expected. "You carry it with you." "I carry what matters," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You wrote on your letter that you could handle a large household." "I can." "This isn't large. It's 3 people and a lot of silence." "Silence doesn't bother me," she said. "I know how to work around it." He looked at her. Really looked the way he had that first moment in the yard, except this time, the calculation was different. This time he was looking for something he didn't have a word for yet. "Dottie ate her full dinner," he said. "I know. She hasn't done that in—" He stopped. "I know," Clara said again, gently. His jaw tightened against whatever was rising up in his chest. "You're good with her." "She's easy to be good with. She's a remarkable little girl." "She is." His voice dropped. "They both are." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm not—" He started and stopped again. "I'm not looking for anything here except someone to cook and keep the house and not disappear on my daughters. You understand that?" "I understand," Clara said. "Good." He moved to leave. "Mr. Calloway." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because Walt's words were still in her head. I've seen that before. On people who are running. Maybe because this man had 2 daughters who had already survived one loss and deserved to know they weren't taking another one on without warning. "If something comes up, something from before I got here, I'm going to tell you, before it gets to your door. That's my word." He turned, looked at her. "Something's coming?" he asked. "I don't know. Maybe not." She held his gaze. "But if it does, I'll tell you first." He stood there in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, reading her face in the lamplight. "All right," he said. He walked down the hall. She heard his door close. Clara stood in the kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. The starter breathed quietly on the shelf. The stove ticked. Somewhere down the hall she could hear Dottie's soft sleep sounds through the wall. She pressed her palms flat on the counter. 3,000 miles. She was still standing. The first week passed the way hard work always passed in the body before the mind, leaving Clara too tired at night to think about anything except what she needed to start at 4 the next morning. She learned the house by feel. She learned that Hank took his coffee black and too hot and drank it standing up. Never sitting like sitting down in the morning was a luxury he'd decided he didn't deserve. She learned that Ruthie ate fast and neat, and always cleared her own plate without being asked, a habit so ingrained it had the quality of penance. She learned that Dottie would appear in the kitchen doorway every morning at 5:15, exactly quilt-dragging hair undone, and that the right thing to do was simply set a stool out and keep talking, and let the girl come the rest of the way on her own. She learned that the silence in this house was not one silence. It was 4 different silences layered on top of each other, and each one had a different weight. On Thursday, Walt took her into Harlan Creek for supplies. The town was smaller than she'd expected. 1 main street, a handful of storefronts, a hotel that looked optimistic about its own future. Walt talked the whole way, in which suited Clara fine, because it meant she could watch the road and the tree line without having to explain why she was doing it. "Pruitt's is the one with the blue door," Walt said. "Nell Pruitt runs it. Her husband passed 7 years ago, and she kept the store and grew it, which half the town thought was inappropriate, and the other half thought was impressive. She'll give you fair weight and won't ask you things that aren't her business, which in a town this size is a genuine gift." Nell Pruitt was a woman somewhere north of 60, with silver hair pinned up sharp, and eyes the color of good riverstone. She looked at Clara the way women who had survived things looked at other women who had survived things, a quick, thorough assessment that ended in something like recognition. "You're the Calloway cook," she said. It wasn't a question. "Clara Bowman." "Nell." She put her hand out and shook Clara's like she meant it. Walt says you need basics and some specifics. Tell me what you're working with and I'll tell you what I can do. Clara handed her the list. Nell read it without comment, then looked up. You're serious about cooking. Last 3 cooks Hank hired wanted tinned everything and the minimum of effort. I'm serious about cooking, Clara confirmed. Good. Nell moved behind the counter. Because those girls need someone serious, Dottie especially. She said it without looking up, pulling flour from the shelf. She was in here with her mother every week before Beth passed. Bright little thing. Haven't seen her in town in 8 months. Hank brings the girls in on Sundays for church and that's it. He keeps them close. He's scared of losing them, Clara said. Nell looked at her over the counter. He's scared of a lot of things, she said. Man that grieved that hard gets scared of everything eventually. You got somewhere to be after this, or do you have time for coffee? I have time. They sat in the back room behind the store while Walt loaded supplies. Nell poured coffee and set out 2 cups and didn't make a production of anything. You're running from someone, Nell said. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. Walt didn't say a word to me. I've got eyes. Nell's voice was matter of fact. You watch every man who comes through that door. You cataloged the 2 exits in this store in the first 30 seconds. You've got old bruising on your left wrist that you keep pulling your sleeve down over. She took a sip of coffee. I've seen it before. I'm aware that's a pattern, Clara said. I'm not judging the pattern. I'm judging the man who created it. Nell set down her cup. This town has a sheriff named Dale Combs. He is not useful to women in your situation. He's useful to men with money and men with guns, and men who are friends with Edmund Voss, which is most of the men who matter in this county. Who's Edmund Voss? Nell's expression shifted. Not fear exactly. The careful way of someone who'd learned to measure words around a particular name. He's the reason 3 families sold their land in the last 2 years and moved on. He's the reason the water rights in this valley are in dispute, even though they've been settled for 40 years. He's the reason Hank Calloway is going to have a problem by spring if he doesn't get ahead of it. She paused. And he's the reason you want to know who your friends are in this town before you need them. So, now you know. Clara looked at this woman she'd met 20 minutes ago and thought about what Walt had said. Nell Pruitt has a long memory for who needs to know things and who doesn't. Why are you telling me this? Because you're cooking for those girls, Nell said simply. And those girls have had enough trouble. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride in. Walt seemed to understand she needed to think. The road wound through scrub and dry grass, the mountains white-capped in the distance, and Clara sat with her hands in her lap and turned over what Nell had told her about Edmund Voss and let it settle somewhere cold and still in the back of her mind. Water rights, land disputes, a sheriff who answered to money. She knew that architecture. Gerald Marsh had built his whole life on that architecture, the careful use of systems that looked legitimate from the outside and were wrought all the way through. She'd spent 3 years inside one of those systems before she understood what it actually was. She didn't say anything to Hank that night. She filed it away instead, the way you filed a thing you might need later, and focused on dinner. It was the end of the 2nd week when Ruthie finally broke. Not the way Clara had expected. Not in anger. In the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night when she appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, and stood there until Clara looked up from the bread she was prepping for morning. I can't sleep, Ruthie said. Sit down, Clara said. Ruthie sat. She pulled her knees up on the stool and wrapped her arms around them and looked at the table. Her eyes were dry, but barely. She called me Mama today, Ruthie said. Clara's hands went still. Dottie, she was half asleep, and I went in to check on her, and she reached up and she called me. Ruthie's throat worked. She knows I'm not. She knows. But she was half asleep and I was just there and she called me, Ruthie, I'm not her mother. The words came out tight and fierce and terrified. I'm 12 years old and I've been trying to... I make sure she brushes her hair and eats her breakfast, and I check her for fever every night because last winter she got sick and Papa was out in the north pasture and I was the one who... She stopped hard. Clara came around the table and sat down across from her. She didn't touch her. Ruthie was not a child who wanted to be touched by someone she didn't trust yet, and Clara knew that and respected it. "You've been mothering her," Clara said, "since Beth died." Somebody had to. It was the same thing she'd said before. But this time, her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her mouth together against it. "Yes," Clara said. "Somebody did, and you did. And you were 8 years old when you started, and that was too much to put on a person, and you have done it anyway every single day, and that is one of the bravest things I have ever heard of." Ruthie looked at her. Her eyes were wet now. She was furious about it. "But you're 12, Clara said. "Not 40. And I'm here now, so you can put some of it down. What if you leave?" Her voice was raw, stripped of all the armor. Just the question underneath everything, the one that had been running the whole operation from the beginning. "What if you leave like everyone leaves and she couldn't finish it?" "Then I will tell you first," Clara said. "I won't disappear. Whatever happens, I will tell you first. Face to face. That's my word." Ruthie looked at her for a long time, looking for the lie in it, the way a child who'd been disappointed enough times learned to look. She didn't find one. She put her face down on her arms on the table and cried. Not the muffled crying Clara had been hearing through walls, but the real kind, ugly and uncontrolled. The kind that had been waiting a long time for a room where it was safe enough to exist. Clara sat with her and didn't say a word. When it was over, Ruthie sat up, wiped her face on her sleeve, and looked mortified. "Don't tell Papa." "I won't." "Or Dottie." "I won't." "Or Walt, because he'll make a thing of it and—" "Ruthie, I won't tell anyone." Clara stood and went back to the bread and started working again. "You want warm milk? I've got enough left from dinner." A pause. "Yes," Ruthie said quietly. Clara warmed the milk. Ruthie sat in the kitchen and didn't talk and didn't need to. When the milk was ready, she drank it and went back to bed. And in the morning she came to breakfast with her armor back in place and didn't acknowledge any of it. But she looked at Clara differently. Just slightly. Just enough. The trouble announced itself on a Friday. Clara was at Pruitt's picking up an order when she heard the voice and heard it before she saw the face, which was how she'd always worked, tracking sound the way a person learned to track sound when sound was the first warning. A man's voice, low and deliberate, asking Nell something at the counter. "Looking for a woman," he said. "Come through here about 3 weeks back. Big woman, dark hair, probably traveling alone." Might have used the name Clara Bowman or Mary Marsh or something else entirely. Clara was in the dry goods aisle. She did not move. "Lots of people come through," Nell said. Her voice gave nothing. "Can't keep track of everyone. This one you'd remember. She's not easy to miss." A pause, and Clara could hear the shape of what he meant in that pause. The contempt dressed up as description. Her husband's been looking for her, worried about her state of mind. That's so. Offering a reward. $50 for information leading to her whereabouts. "I'll keep my eyes open," Nell said pleasantly. "You want anything else, flour, salt, pork? We've got good salt pork this week." A silence. Then the door opened and closed. Clara stayed in the dry goods aisle for 30 seconds. Then she walked to the counter. Nell was already looking at her. Her expression was utterly calm. "He's new in town," she said. "Name's Alderman. I don't know him. He's staying at the hotel." She paused. "You've got about 48 hours before he works his way through everyone who might know something." "Gerald sent him," Clara said. Her voice was even. She was proud of her voice. "He doesn't come himself. Not first. He sends someone to locate and then he comes." "How much time does that buy you?" "Enough to decide what to do." Clara picked up her order basket. "Thank you, Nell. Don't thank me. Come back Tuesday and I'll have your flour order ready." Nell's eyes were steady on hers. "And think about who else needs to know, because a woman alone with information is a target. A woman with allies is a problem." Clara drove the wagon back to the ranch. She had decided what to do before she was halfway there, not because it was easy, but because it was the only choice that sat honest. She'd told Hank she would come to him before trouble came to his door. She found him in the barn, which was where he seemed to spend the hours between the day's work ending and dinner, doing the small necessary things that kept a ranch from falling apart at its edges. He looked up when she came in. "You're back early," he said. "I need to tell you something." He set down the harness he was mending, read her face, leaned against the stall door, and crossed his arms, not defensively, more like bracing. "Tell me. My name before I came here was Clara Marsh. I married Gerald Marsh when I was 22, and I left him 8 months ago. What I told you was the truth. He's a man who hurts people. He's been looking for me since I left." She kept her eyes on his. "He sent someone to Harlan Creek, a man named Alderman. He's asking about me in town. I've got maybe 2 days before word gets back to Gerald, and he comes himself." Hank was quiet for a moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was processing something, not shutting down she'd learned, but going very still, the way a man went still when he was thinking hard. "You knew this was coming," he said. "When you said you'd tell me first. I knew it was possible. I hoped the distance was enough." She kept her voice steady. "It wasn't. I'm sorry for bringing it to your door. That wasn't my intention." "What does he do?" Hank said. "When he finds you, he takes me back." The simple plainness of it. He has money, and a lawyer, and a judge in his county who does what he's told. He'll claim I'm unstable. He's done it before. He had my neighbor committed for 6 months for telling someone what she'd seen in my house. She paused. "He doesn't use his fists where anyone can see. He uses paper." Hank's jaw tightened. "How much paper does he have on you?" "Enough to make trouble. Not enough to win if I fight it in the right place." She took a breath. "If I had time and money for a lawyer, I could fight the claim. He doesn't have a legitimate case. He just has the ability to make the process so exhausting and expensive that most women give up." "You're not most women," Hank said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation. Clara received it as one. "I need you to know that if he comes here, I'm not going with him," she said. "Not peacefully, not under any circumstances. And I need you to know that might create a problem for you, for the ranch, for the girls." She looked at him directly. "If you need me to leave before that happens, I understand. I'll go quietly, and I won't hold it against you." Hank pushed off the stall door and stood to his full height. He was not a dramatically large man, but he took up space in a way that was hard to explain, something about the deliberateness of how he moved, like each step was a decision. "You're not leaving," he said. "Hank, my name's on the advertisement. You answered it legal. You're employed here, you're on my property, and any man who comes to my door claiming otherwise is going to have a conversation with me first." His voice was flat. Certain. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was done negotiating with himself about it. "You hear me?" Clara looked at him. "I hear you," she said. "Good." He picked up the harness again. "Dinner at 6. "Yes." She turned to go. "Clara." She stopped. He wasn't looking at her. He was working the leather in his hands, focused down. "You should know what Nell Pruitt said about Edmund Voss." She turned sharply. He glanced up. "Nell talks to Walt. Walt talks to me. She told him she'd told you." He paused. "Voss has been sending men around the neighboring ranches, making offers. The kind of offers that come with a deadline." He set down the harness and looked at her directly. "I've been waiting to see if you'd bring it up yourself." Clara stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at this man who had apparently been doing his own reading of her the same way she'd been reading him. "I was going to," she said. "I know." He picked up the harness. "Go start dinner. We'll talk after the girls are in bed." She went. Walking back across the yard, she felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for, not safety, because she knew better than to call anything safe yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that felt like standing on ground that wasn't moving, even if the sky above it wasn't entirely clear. She went to the kitchen. She checked the starter, which was bubbling steadily on its shelf, warm and alive and doing its slow, necessary work. She started dinner. Dottie appeared at 5:15, right on schedule, quilt and all. "What are we making?" she asked, climbing onto her stool. "Beef stew," Clara said. "And bread, because there's always bread." "Because bread is honest," Dottie said very seriously. Clara looked at her. "That's right," she said. "You remembered." Dottie smiled, a small, careful thing, like a door opening an inch. "I remember everything you say," she said. "I write it down." "You write it down?" "In my book." She pulled at a loose thread on her quilt. "The things that are true. I write down the true things so I don't lose them." Clara turned back to the stew and was glad she was facing away because her eyes were burning. "That's a very smart thing to do," she said. "I know," said Dottie cheerfully and picked up a potato. Hank was already at the kitchen table when Clara came back downstairs after checking that both girls were asleep. He had the ranch ledgers open, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his hands the way a man looked at his hands when he was thinking about something too large to fit into regular thought. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. "Tell me about Voss," she said. Hank wrapped both hands around the cup. "Edmund Voss came to this county 6 years ago with money from back east and a lawyer named Pritchard, who's never lost a case in this jurisdiction, which tells you everything you need to know about the jurisdiction." He looked up. "He's been buying land, some of it willing sellers, people who were already struggling and took the offer because it was easier than fighting. Some of it not so willing." "What does not so willing look like?" "The Hendersons lost their water access 2 springs ago. Their creek ran through a corner of land Voss had purchased, and Pritchard found language in the original deed that gave the property owner control of water flow. Technically legal. Practically theft." Hank's jaw tightened. "The Hendersons held out 4 months and then sold. Couldn't run cattle without water." "And your water?" "My water comes from Callaway Creek, which has been on this land since my grandfather dug the original channel in 1851. It's in the deed, it's in the territorial records, and it's not in dispute." He paused. "Or it wasn't. Pritchard filed a motion last month claiming the creek's natural course predates the deed, and therefore the water belongs to the county, not to any individual holder." Clara was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "That's not a legal argument," she said. "That's a delay tactic. He files the motion, it ties up the deed in territorial court for a year, and while it's tied up, you can't sell, can't borrow against the land, can't prove clean title for anything." Hank looked at her. "You know territorial law. My father was a land clerk in Ohio for 20 years. I grew up reading property documents the way other girls read novels." She met his gaze. "I'm not just a cook, Hank. I told you that." "You did." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got maybe $1,200 liquid. A lawyer to fight the motion would cost twice that before we even got to a hearing." "Do you have the original deed?" "Somewhere. My father kept everything. Boxes in the back room that I haven't touched since he passed. We need to look through them." Clara leaned forward. "If your grandfather's deed includes explicit water rights language and predates any county filing, Voss's motion fails on its face. You don't need to win the argument. You just need to show the original documentation is ironclad enough that fighting it costs Voss more than it costs you." "Men like Voss have more money than me. The cost equation always favors them." "Not if you shift what they're spending it on." Clara's voice was careful, deliberate. "Men like Voss operate in the dark. They use legal language because it's complicated enough that people don't understand what's being done to them until it's too late. But the moment you bring it into the open, the moment regular people understand that he's not a businessman making fair offers, but a man using manufactured legal claims to steal land that families have worked for generations, the calculation changes." Hank studied her face. "You're talking about public pressure." "I'm talking about the truth told loudly enough that it can't be ignored." He was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. "You've fought something like this before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Gerald didn't just use his fists, Clara said. When I tried to leave the first time, he had a judge sign an order declaring me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. Every account I had access to was frozen. Every person I might have gone to for help was given a version of events that made me sound unstable. She kept her voice even. He built a cage out of paperwork. I spent 8 months figuring out how the cage worked before I found the door. Hank's hands tightened around his cup. I know how these men think, Clara said. I know where the weaknesses are, and I'm telling you, Voss has weaknesses. The question is whether you want to fight or whether you want to sell. I'm not selling, Hank said. The words came out flat and final, the way words came out when they'd been decided a long time ago. Then we need to look through your father's boxes. They found them at midnight, stacked in the back room, under 20 years of accumulated ranch paperwork, and Hank pulled the first one out and set it on the table, and they started going through it together. It was slow work. His father had not been an organized man. Receipts and correspondence and legal documents were layered together without system, and every page needed to be checked. Clara found the deed at 1:15 in the morning at the bottom of the third box in an envelope that had been sealed with wax. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Hank without speaking. He read it. His throat moved. Water rights therein, he said. Explicit and primary, dated 1849, registered in the territorial office in 1851. Voss's motion claims the water predates the deed. The deed predates the motion by 30 years. Clara sat back. This doesn't end the fight, but it changes the shape of it entirely. You're not defending against a legitimate claim. You're proving a fraud. Pritchard will argue the language is ambiguous. Let him argue it. The moment he argues it publicly, every rancher in this county who's lost land or water access to Voss in the last 6 years is going to want to know if their situation looked the same. She looked at Hank steadily. Voss doesn't want scrutiny. That's why he uses the legal system. It's slow and complicated, and most people can't afford to see it through. The moment you make this a public fight instead of a private one, you change his risk calculation entirely. Hank set down the deed and looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low, and they'd been at this for 2 hours, and she could see the exhaustion on his face. But underneath it, something else, something that had been absent when she'd arrived, and was now present in a way that changed the whole quality of his expression. I hired a cook, he said. You hired whoever answered your advertisement, Clara said. You got me. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, close. He reached across the table and picked up the deed carefully and put it back in its envelope. I'm going to town tomorrow. I want to get this recorded at the county office before Pritchard has any reason to think we found it. Take Walt with you. Why? Because if Voss has someone watching, and he likely does, you want a witness to the filing. Someone who can testify to the time and circumstances. She paused. And because you shouldn't go alone. He looked at her. You think he'd move against me physically? I think men who build empires on fraud don't stop at paperwork when the paperwork stops working. She held his gaze. Take Walt. He nodded once. Fine. Clara stood and carried both coffee cups to the basin. She was tired in her bones, the good kind of tired that came from work that mattered, and her back ached from the hours bent over the boxes. Clara. She turned. Hank was still at the table, the envelope in his hand, looking at her. What you did tonight, going through all of this, knowing what to look for. He paused. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said simply. Why? She thought about Dottie, writing true things in her book so she wouldn't lose them. She thought about Ruthie's face when she'd finally stopped holding everything together alone. She thought about this house that had been full of grief and silence when she arrived and was slowly, stubbornly becoming something else. Because this is worth fighting for, she said, and I know how to fight this particular fight. She set the cups down. Get some sleep. You've got an early ride tomorrow. She went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the house breathe and thought about Gerald's man in Harlan Creek, sitting in the hotel, working his way through conversations, and felt the cold, familiar shape of that threat sitting in her chest the way it always sat, heavy and patient. She had 2 days, maybe less. She needed to be smarter than the timeline. In the morning, she found Nell Pruitt's boy waiting by the barn with a folded note. She read it standing in the yard, the early light sharp and cold. Alderman left the hotel this morning. Don't know direction. Could be riding to send word. Could be riding to fetch. N. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket and went inside and made breakfast. She was putting plates on the table when Ruthie came downstairs and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with those careful, measuring eyes. "Something's wrong," Ruthie said. "Eat your breakfast," Clara said. "That's not a no." "Ruthie?" "I'm 12, not 5. Ruthie crossed the kitchen and sat down and looked at Clara directly with a steadiness that was eerie in someone her age. "Is it the man who's looking for you?" Clara set down the coffee pot. "What do you know about that? Walt mentioned it to Papa, and Papa didn't close the window all the way when they talked on the porch." Ruthie's chin came up. "Don't be angry at Walt. He didn't know I could hear." Clara sat down across from her. "His name is Gerald Marsh," she said, because Ruthie had earned honesty more than she'd earned protection. "He's my husband. He hurts people, and I left him, and he's been looking for me since." Ruthie was quiet, processing. "Is he coming here? He sent someone first, to find out where I was. And now he knows. Probably." Ruthie's jaw set in the way it set when she was deciding something. "Papa won't let him take you." "I know. Papa said that, or you just know it." He said it. Something shifted in Ruthie's face, a tension she'd been carrying between her shoulder blades for as long as Clara had known her, releasing fractionally. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She pulled her plate toward her and started eating, and after a moment she said without looking up, "I'm glad he said that." "Me too," Clara said quietly. Dottie came downstairs, then hair brushed for once in the dress she'd told Clara last week was her good one, which was simply the one that fit properly. She sat down and looked between them. "Why do you both look like that?" "Like what?" Ruthie said. "Like something happened, but you decided it was okay." Ruthie looked at Clara. Clara looked at Dottie. "Something happened," Clara said, "and we decided it was going to be okay." Dottie picked up her fork. "Good," she said with the serene confidence of a child who had decided to believe the adults, at least for today. "Because I want to learn how to make the honey bread today, the kind with the swirl." "After your father gets back from town," Clara said, "we'll make it together." Hank came back from town at 4 in the afternoon. Clara heard the horses from the kitchen and watched through the window without letting herself be seen watching. He and Walt rode in at a pace that said nothing had gone wrong. He came to the kitchen door and knocked once, which he'd started doing sometime in the second week, and which still surprised her each time. "It's filed," he said. "Clerk recorded it, dated and witnessed. Walt signed as secondary witness." He paused. "Pritchard was in town. He saw us coming out of the recorder's office." "How did he react?" "He didn't. That's what worried me." Hank came inside and stood by the stove warming his hands. "A man who reacts when his plan gets disrupted, that man's improvising. A man who doesn't react might already have another move waiting. That's a careful way of thinking. I've had time to learn careful." He looked at her. "Nell Pruitt sent word to 3 other ranch families about the deed filing. Families who've had dealings with Voss. She wants them to come to town Saturday for what she's calling a supply meeting, which is what people call meetings they don't want Voss to know about." Clara absorbed this. "She moves fast. Nell's been waiting for someone to give her something to move with." He paused. "She wants you there. Says you understand the legal situation better than anyone who's likely to show up." "She's never even seen me think about legal questions." She saw enough. He looked at her steadily. "Will you come?" "Yes," Clara said. He nodded. He started to move toward the hallway, and then stopped, and she could see him making a decision about something, working up to it the way people worked up to things that felt larger than ordinary conversation. "My wife, Beth," he said. He was looking at the wall rather than at her. She was good at that. At reading a room, reading people, knowing which way a thing was going to fall before it fell. He paused. I'd forgotten what it looked like in practice. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in this house who... He stopped. Hank, I'm not saying anything, he said quickly. I'm not trying to say anything. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face that he clearly hadn't meant to put there. Something that had gotten past whatever system of management he'd built over the last 2 years. I'm glad you answered the advertisement, he said. That's all. Clara looked at him across the kitchen. This man who'd built a fortress out of grief and silence and the determination to keep his daughters safe, and felt something warm and dangerous move through her chest. I'm glad I did too, she said. He left. She stood with both hands on the counter and breathed carefully and told herself to be sensible. She was still telling herself that when she heard the horse. It was not the sound of a familiar horse on a familiar path. It was a single rider coming in fast, which was almost never good news, and Clara was already moving to the window when the voice called from the yard. Hank Calloway. A man's voice rough with urgency. Hank, you need to come out here. Hank was out the front door before Clara reached the window. She went to the kitchen door instead and stood where she could hear without being seen. It was a man from one of the neighboring ranches the Beaumont spread 3 miles east. He was still in the saddle, his horse breathing hard. Tom, Hank said. What is it? Voss's men were on your south fence line this afternoon, Tom said. Not looking, cutting. I saw them from my ridge, 4 men with wire cutters working a section about a 1/4 mile from your creek access. Hank's voice went very still. How much did they cut? Enough to push cattle through. Your herd's not near that section today, but if they drift south in the next day or 2, they'll be on open land without fencing, Hank said, and I'll spend a week rounding them up and have no way to prove it wasn't a break in the fence. That's how I read it, Tom said. I came straight here. Clara heard Hank call for Walt. She heard the 2 of them talking low and fast, and then horses moving and then quiet. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen. This was the second move. She'd known there would be a second move. Hank had been right about Pritchard, right about the man who already had something waiting. The deed filing had been too fast, too clean. Voss had needed to respond on a different front. Fence cutting was old. Older than law in most of the territories. It was the kind of thing that was almost impossible to prove and incredibly easy to do. And it communicated one thing with perfect clarity. I can reach you anywhere on your land at any time, and there is nothing you can do about it. She heard small feet behind her. Dottie was standing in the kitchen doorway with her book in her hands, the small journal she'd told Clara she wrote true things in. Her face was pale. Something bad is happening, Dottie said. There's a problem with the ranch, Clara said carefully. Your papa and Walt are handling it. Is it the same man, the one in town? No, this is a different problem. Clara moved to the table and sat down and looked at Dottie directly. Come here. Dottie came and sat across from her and put the book on the table between them. How many problems are there? She asked. Clara thought about how to answer that honestly without frightening her more than she already was. Right now, 2, she said. Your papa is dealing with one. I'm dealing with the other. Are you scared? A little? Dottie seemed to find this reassuring rather than alarming, which told Clara everything about what this child had learned to do with adult honesty. Ruthie says scared people either run or they stay and fight, she said. She says you're a stayer. Ruthie said that yesterday, after breakfast. Dottie opened her book not to show Clara, just to hold it. She said she didn't like you when you came, but she changed her mind. She said she could tell you weren't going to run. Clara sat with that for a moment. She's right, she said finally. I'm not running. Dottie put her small hand on the table between them, palm up. It was the most deliberate gesture Clara had seen from her, not unconscious, not accidental, but chosen. An offering. Clara put her hand over Dottie's. Write that down, Clara said. In your book, write down that Clara Bowman sat in this kitchen on this day and promised she wasn't running. Dottie picked up her pencil and wrote it carefully, letter by letter. They were still sitting like that when Ruthie came downstairs and stopped in the doorway and looked at both of them. "What are we doing?" she said. "Writing down true things," Dottie said. Ruthie looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. Something passed between them. Not words, not quite, but the kind of understanding that happened when two people had been paying close enough attention to each other to skip the words. Ruthie pulled out a chair and sat down. "Fine," she said. "Then write this one down too." She reached over and took the pencil from her sister's hand and wrote 4 words in the book herself, then slid it back. Dottie looked at it. Then she looked at Ruthie. Then she looked at Clara. She turned the book around so Clara could read it. "We are not leaving." Clara kept her face steady. She was getting very good at keeping her face steady in this kitchen. "No," she said. "We're not." Outside, she could hear Hank's horse coming back across the yard, and the low sound of Walt's voice, and the particular silence of a ranch settling into an evening that was going to require all of them to be braver than they felt. Tomorrow, Nell Pruitt's meeting would happen. Tomorrow, Gerald Marsh was one day closer. Tomorrow, Edmund Voss would wake up and make his next move. But right now, Clara Bowman was sitting at a kitchen table with 2 girls who had written her name in a book of true things, and the starter was breathing on its shelf, and the bread she'd put in before Tom Beaumont rode into the yard was almost ready. She could smell it, that toasty, warm shift in the air that meant something good had just happened. She got up to check the oven. Nell Pruitt's supply meeting happened at 7 in the morning in the back room of the general store, and by the time Clara and Hank arrived, 6 other ranch families were already there. She knew them by their posture before she knew their names. People who had been holding on by their fingernails long enough that sitting in a room together felt like both relief and risk. The Beaumonts were there, Tom and his wife Margaret. The Sutter family from the North Valley. 2 brothers named Crane, who ran sheep on the eastern ridge and had been disputing a water access claim for 14 months. An older woman named Frances Dodd, who had come alone and sat with her hands folded on the table like she was in church and had made her peace with God about whatever came next. Nell stood at the head of the table and didn't waste time. "Edmund Voss has filed motions against 3 properties in this room in the last 8 months, she said. "He's cut fence on 2 more. He sent a man to the recorder's office last week to pull original deed records on every parcel in the valley, which tells you exactly what he's looking for and exactly what he plans to do with it." She looked around the table. "What he's counting on is that we'll deal with it separately. Each family alone, each problem framed as a private legal matter, too complicated and too expensive to fight. He's right that it's expensive. He's wrong that it's complicated." She turned to Clara. "Clara Bowman understands the legal structure of what he's doing better than anyone in this room. Clara." Every face turned to her. Clara had spent 15 years making herself small in rooms full of people. She felt the old pull of it, the instinct to hedge, to qualify, to take up less space than she'd been offered. She let it pass through her and set it down and stood up straight. "What Voss is doing is called title clouding," she said. "He files motions that challenge the legal clarity of your deed, not because the motions have merit, but because a clouded title freezes everything. You can't sell, you can't borrow against the land, and in some cases, you can't even prove your water rights are enforceable while the motion is pending." She looked around the table. "He doesn't need to win in court. He needs you to run out of money or patience before it ever gets to court." "So how do we stop it?" Tom Beaumont said. "You file your original documentation at the Territorial Recorder's Office in Cheyenne, not the county office. The county recorder answers to the county judge, and the county judge answers to Voss's lawyer's money. The territorial office answers to the federal government and is considerably harder to influence." She paused. "Every deed in this room that predates Voss's motions supersedes them on its face. He knows this. He's counting on none of you knowing it." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of people who didn't understand. The silence of people who were understanding something for the first time and feeling what it felt like to have been deliberately kept from understanding it. Frances Dodd spoke first. "My deed goes back to 1847, she said. "My husband filed it himself when we first came out. I've got the original in a strongbox." "That's older than anything Voss can challenge," Clara said. "Who pays for the territorial filing?" one of the Crane brothers asked. "It's $12 per parcel," Clara said. "If we pool it across this table, it's less than $2 a family." Nell was already writing. "I'll cover any family that can't make the $2, she said in the tone of someone who had already decided this before she walked in. The meeting ran 90 minutes. By the end, every family in the room had committed to filing. Nell had a list and a timeline, and the kind of organized efficiency that came from running a business alone for 7 years and not having the luxury of waiting for someone else to handle things. Walking out to the wagon afterward, Hank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You just organized 11 families in 90 minutes. "Nell organized them," Clara said. "I just gave them a reason. You know what the difference between those two things is?" He helped her up to the wagon seat, which he'd started doing somewhere in the 3rd week, without either of them noting it. "Nothing. They're the same thing." She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead, but the corner of his mouth had that almost quality to it, the one she'd learned to read as the closest thing he had to an open smile. She looked away before she let herself think too much about that. They were halfway back to the ranch when she saw the horse tied outside the hotel, and something in her body registered it before her mind did a cold dropping sensation like a stone through still water. The horse was a bay with a white blaze heavily built with expensive tack that had been maintained so well it shone even with trail dust on it. She knew that horse. "Hank," she said. He'd already seen her face. "What is it?" "That horse at the hotel." She kept her voice even. "Gerald's here." Hank's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't stop the wagon. He kept it moving at the same pace, deliberate, unhurried, and said, "Does he know you're in this wagon?" "Not yet." "Then we keep moving." He didn't look at her. "We go back to the ranch, we get Walt, and we think this through. We don't let him pick the ground. He'll come to the ranch. Let him come." Hank's voice had gone to that flat, certain place. "My ground. My rules." They made it back in 40 minutes. Walt was in the yard when they pulled in, and he read the situation off Hank's face before either of them spoke. "How long?" he said. "He was at the hotel when we came through town," Hank said. "Maybe an hour, maybe less. I'll get the hands in from the south pasture." Walt was already moving. "Walt?" Clara's voice stopped him. "Don't make it look like a confrontation waiting to happen. He'll use that. He'll say he came peacefully and was threatened." She knew how Gerald built his cases, each piece placed carefully, each witness primed to see what he needed them to see. "Bring the men in for a regular end-of-day muster. Nothing more." Walt looked at Hank. Hank nodded. Walt went. "Walt." Clara went inside. Ruthie was at the kitchen table doing sums and looked up the moment Clara walked in and said, "What happened?" "Gerald is in Harlan Creek." Clara said it cleanly without softening it because Ruthie had earned the real information. "He'll probably come here." Ruthie put down her pencil. "What do we do?" "Where's Dottie?" "Upstairs. Reading. I need her to stay upstairs when he comes. Can you do that? Stay with her, keep her quiet. Don't come down regardless of what you hear." Clara looked at her directly. "I need to know you're both safe so I can focus on what's happening in this room." Ruthie stood up. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set with that characteristic Calloway steadiness. "You can count on me," she said. "I know I can. That's why I'm asking." Clara put her hand briefly on Ruthie's shoulder. "Take your sums book up. Make it feel normal for Dottie. She'll follow your mood." Ruthie picked up her book and went upstairs without another word. Clara stood in the kitchen and breathed and thought about what she knew about Gerald Marsh. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who made visible threats. He was precise and controlled, and he used the law the way other men used fists with accuracy, with the confidence that came from knowing you had more resources than whoever you were hitting. He would come to this ranch with documents. He would be polite. He would frame everything as concern. She went to the shelf where she'd stored the papers she'd been accumulating since the night she and Hank had gone through the deed boxes. She pulled out the ones that mattered and put them in her apron pocket. Then she started making bread because her hands needed something honest to do. Gerald came at 4 o'clock. She heard him before she saw him. That particular knock 3 times measured the knock of a man who had never had to wonder if a door would be opened to him. She heard Hank's boots on the porch. She heard the door. "Mr. Calloway." Gerald's voice was exactly as she remembered. Warm. Reasonable. The voice of a man explaining something to someone who simply didn't understand yet. "My name is Gerald Marsh. I believe you may have a woman in your employ who is my wife. I've come a very long way because I'm concerned about her well-being." "I employ a woman named Clara Bowman," Hank said. "Don't know anyone named Marsh." "Of course, she's been using an assumed name. She has a history of confusion regarding her situation. The doctors in Boston have been quite worried." A pause, during which Clara could hear Gerald pulling something from his coat. "I have documentation here from her physician and from the county court. She's not well, Mr. Calloway. I've come to take her home where she can get proper care." Clara walked out of the kitchen. She came down the hall and stood in the entrance, and Gerald turned at the sound of her footsteps and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He had not changed. That was the thing that always startled her in her imagination, and startled her now in reality. She had changed so completely that she expected the change to be visible on him too, as if surviving him should have altered his face. But he looked the same. Good coat, good boots, silver beginning at his temples, the mild, pleasant expression of a man who was entirely comfortable with himself. "Clara." He said it like relief, like he was the victim of her departure and her presence proved something. "Gerald." She kept her voice level. "Thank God." He took a step toward her, and she didn't move back, and something flickered in his eyes at that, just briefly, the recalculation of a man who had expected a different reaction. "I've been so worried. After you left the way you did without a word, without—" "I left a word," Clara said. "I left several. You just didn't like them." His expression shifted, still controlled, still pleasant, but with something sharper underneath. "She does this," he said to Hank, conversationally, as if Clara weren't standing right there. "She rewrites history. The doctors warned me about this pattern. It's part of why she needs supervised care." "I'd like to see those documents," Clara said. "Clara, there's no need to make this difficult." "The documents you showed Mr. Calloway." She held out her hand. "I'd like to see them." A pause. Gerald looked at her outstretched hand. Then he looked at her face. She could see him reading her reading that she was different, reading that the woman who had spent 3 years being managed by careful words and controlled silences had been replaced by someone he didn't have a complete map of yet. He handed her the documents. She read through them carefully, standing in the hallway, while Gerald watched, and Hank stood 3 feet away with his arms at his sides and said nothing. The physician's letter was from a Dr. Harold Sims of Boston. She'd never met Dr. Sims. She'd never been a patient of Dr. Sims. The court order was signed by Judge Arthur Fennell, who had been Gerald's fraternity brother at Yale, and had signed 3 previous documents on Gerald's behalf in the time she'd been married to him. She folded the documents and handed them back. "These are fraudulent," she said. Gerald's pleasant expression didn't waver. "I understand you believe that. Dr. Sims has never treated me. I have never been his patient. The court order was obtained without my presence or representation from a judge who has a documented personal relationship with you." She kept her voice as calm as his. "In the territory of Wyoming, a Massachusetts court order has no enforcement jurisdiction without territorial validation. You'd need to apply to the territorial court in Cheyenne, which would require my presence at a hearing, at which point I would present evidence of the abuse that caused me to leave." She paused. "You don't want that hearing, Gerald." Something moved in his face, the first genuine thing she'd seen there. "You've been talking to lawyers. he said. "I've been reading," she said. "I had a lot of time on the train." "Clara." His voice dropped lower, more private, the voice he used when he wanted to remind her that they had a history only the two of them knew, and that history was leverage. "Come home. Whatever you think happened between us, we can address it. I've spoken to the pastor. I've been counseling with Dr. Sims." "Stop." She said it quietly. "I know every word of this speech. I know the version where you're contrite, and the version where you're reasonable, and the version where you're concerned. I've heard them all. They don't work anymore." She looked at him directly. "I'm not coming home. We are finished. Whatever legal process you want to begin in the territorial court, begin it. But you will not walk me out of this house today. You don't have the resources to fight a legal claim. She does." Hank's voice flat and hard and final. Gerald turned to look at him like he'd forgotten he was there. "Whatever it costs to fight your claim in territorial court," Hank said. "I'll put it up. And I've got 11 ranch families in this valley who just spent this morning learning how to fight men who use legal systems to take things that don't belong to them." He took one step forward. "You picked the wrong county to come to Mr. Marsh." Gerald looked at Hank, then back at Clara. She could see him working through it, the resources he'd expected her not to have, the allies. He hadn't anticipated the woman who was standing in a ranch hallway, meeting his eyes without flinching. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Clara said. "It's not. But it's not going to end the way you planned." The door opened before Gerald could respond. Walt came in, and behind him, Nell Pruitt, and behind Nell, Frances Dodd and Margaret Beaumont, and behind them 3 other women from the morning's meeting, all of whom had apparently received word from Nell in the hours since, and had come without being asked twice. Gerald looked at the room full of people. Nell Pruitt looked at Gerald Marsh with the expression of a woman who had been running a business alone in a frontier town for 7 years, and had not once in that time been impressed by a man in a good coat. "Mr. Marsh," she said pleasantly. "I'm Nell Pruitt. I run the general store. I also sit on the town council, and I'm the one who manages the town's relationship with the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne." She folded her hands in front of her. "I want you to know that whatever happens in this house today, I will be writing a full account of it for that paper, with names, and I type very fast." Something drained from Gerald's face. "The territorial paper," he said. "And the Denver Post has a correspondent in our county," Margaret Beaumont said from behind Nell. "My cousin. He's been looking for a good story." Gerald looked around the room at Hank, at Walt, at Nell, at the women standing behind her, at Clara. He was doing the mathematics of it, the calculation he always did. Costs versus outcomes, control versus exposure. He had come expecting to find a woman alone. He looked at Clara one more time, and she saw in his face the moment he understood that she was not alone, and had not been alone for some time, and was not going to be alone again. "We'll resolve this legally," he said. His voice had recovered its composure, but the warmth was gone from it. "Through proper channels." "We look forward to it," Clara said. He left. The room held its breath for 3 seconds after the door closed. Then Walt let out a long exhale, and Nell moved to the kitchen table like she owned it, and sat down, and Margaret Beaumont put her hand on Clara's arm briefly, and Hank stood in the middle of the room, looking at Clara with something in his face she hadn't seen there before. "You knew," he said quietly. "When you sent Walt for the women, you knew he'd calculate the witnesses. I knew the version of Gerald that comes in alone isn't the same as the version that's being watched by 8 people, and a woman with a connection to the territorial press." Clara's hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. "He'll try the legal route now, file in Cheyenne, which I can fight with time and documentation and a legitimate hearing." "We'll fight it," Hank said. The correction was quiet and immediate. She looked at him. He said again, steady. No room for negotiation. Nell was already pouring coffee from the pot on the stove, like she'd been doing it for years. "Sit down, both of you," she said. "There are things to plan, and coffee helps." She looked up. "Also, your bread is going to burn." Clara crossed to the oven and pulled the loaves out perfect, just barely. The crust exactly the color it should be, and set them on the rack and stood with her back to the room for just a moment. Her hands were not steady anymore. Now that it was over, this particular piece of it, this round, her hands had decided they were allowed to shake, and she let them, just for a moment, pressed flat on the counter. She heard small feet on the stairs. Dottie appeared in the kitchen doorway. Ruthie one step behind her with her hand on her sister's shoulder. Dottie looked at the room full of people at the coffee cups, at her father's face, at Clara standing at the counter. "Is he gone?" Dottie asked. "He's gone," Clara said. Dottie crossed the kitchen without hesitation and pressed herself against Clara's side, both arms around her waist, face turned into her apron. Clara put one hand on the back of her head. Ruthie stood in the doorway. She didn't move forward. She was 12, and she had her dignity and a room full of adults watching. But she looked at Clara over Dottie's head, and Clara looked back at her, and what passed between them didn't need words and didn't get any. Nell watched all of this over the rim of her coffee cup. "That bread smells right," she said. "Someone slice it before it steams itself to death." Hank picked up the knife, and in the kitchen of the Calloway Ranch, with evening coming down, and Gerald Marsh riding away, and Edmund Voss still waiting somewhere with his next move. 11 people sat around a table that wasn't big enough for all of them, and passed bread and talked about what came next. Clara stood at the stove and listened to the room fill with sound, real sound, the kind a house made when the people in it had decided to stay, and thought that this was what she had been running toward all those miles, all those trains, all that distance, not away from Gerald, toward this. Gerald Marsh filed his territorial claim 11 days later. The paperwork arrived at the county recorder's office on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Nell Pruitt knew about it, and by Thursday evening, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with Hank reading through every page of it, while the girls did their schoolwork upstairs, and the starter breathed on its shelf, and the stove ticked quietly in the corner. It was exactly what she'd expected. Petition for spousal return based on mental incompetence. Dr. Sims's letter repackaged for territorial jurisdiction. 3 character references from Boston men she'd met twice at dinner parties, and who had never once spoken directly to her. A statement from Gerald himself, 4 pages long, written in the careful, reasonable language of a man who had spent considerable time with lawyers and understood that the most dangerous words were the ones that sounded least dangerous. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "He's good at this," she said. "He's had practice," Hank said. "The hearing is set for 6 weeks out. Territorial Court in Cheyenne." She looked at the calendar she'd tacked to the kitchen wall when she first arrived, the one she'd been crossing days off without letting herself think too much about why counting days felt necessary. "That's enough time." "For what?" "For me to build a counter record." She pulled the papers toward her and started making notes on a clean sheet. "His case rests on 3 things: the physician's letter, the character references, and the claim that I abandoned the marriage without cause. I can challenge the physician on grounds that he never treated me. The character references are men who don't know me. And the abandonment claim." She paused and her hand slowed on the paper. "Clara." Hank's voice was quiet. "The abandonment claim requires me to prove cause," she said, "which means documenting the abuse in a way that holds up to a territorial judge." She set down the pencil. "I have scars. Dr. Harrison documented them when I first arrived. I have Nell's account of what she observed. But Gerald will bring his own doctor and his own witnesses and his own version of every event, and without corroboration from Boston. Then we get corroboration from Boston." She looked at him. "Walt has a brother in Kansas City who runs freight," Hank said. "He knows people in every city between here and the eastern seaboard. If there are women in Boston who saw something, who knew something, who might be willing to put their name to a statement—" He held her gaze. "Let me try." "Hank, that could take weeks and cost—" "I know what it'll cost." He didn't look away. "I've been keeping the ranch ledger for 15 years. I know exactly what I have and what I can spend and what I'm willing to spend it on." He paused. "Let me try." Clara looked at this man across her kitchen table. This man who had posted an advertisement that said no questions asked and had meant it in ways neither of them had understood at the time, and felt something in her chest that she had stopped trying to name 3 weeks ago, because naming it felt too large and too permanent, and she hadn't trusted permanence in a very long time. "All right," she said. "Try." The next 6 weeks were the kind of weeks that compressed time each day, full enough that she fell into bed exhausted, and each week somehow passing faster than the one before. Walt's brother in Kansas City made inquiries. Letters went east. Hank rode to Cheyenne twice to speak with a territorial lawyer named Augustus Crane. No relation to the Crane brothers, who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers found inconvenient. Edmund Voss, perhaps sensing that the landscape had shifted, went quiet. No new motions, no fence cutting. Nell reported that Pritchard had been seen at the hotel twice in 2 weeks, which she interpreted as a man whose client was reconsidering the risk calculation. The deed filings from all 11 ranch families had gone through the territorial office in Cheyenne without complication, and whatever legal architecture Voss had been building in the county court had quietly ceased to expand. He wasn't gone. Clara knew he wasn't gone. Men like Voss didn't disappear, they recalibrated. But recalibration took time, and time was what they needed. Meanwhile, the girls grew into the routine the way children grew into things that were good for them steadily, without drama, as if it had always been this way. Dottie baked bread with Clara every Saturday, and had developed opinions about hydration ratios that were technically correct and delivered with complete seriousness. Ruthie had stopped cataloging Clara's probable departure date, and had started asking questions about the territorial legal system that were sharp enough to make Augustus Crane, when he visited the ranch once in late October, look at her and say to Hank, "That girl should be a lawyer." Hank had looked at Ruthie like he was seeing something he'd been too close to recognize. "She should be whatever she decides," he'd said. Ruthie had not smiled, but she'd stood up straighter. The letter from Boston came on a Wednesday 3 weeks before the hearing. Walt brought it in from town with the supply run and handed it to Clara in the kitchen without ceremony, and she turned it over in her hands and recognized the handwriting on the outside and sat down before she opened it. It was from a woman named Dorothy Hale, who had lived 2 houses down from Clara and Gerald in Boston for 4 years. They had not been close. Gerald had not encouraged closeness with neighbors. But Dorothy Hale had eyes, and she had used them, and whatever Walt's brother had said to her, it had been enough. The letter was 3 pages. Clara read it once, and then sat with it in her hands and looked at the wall for a long time. Hank came in from outside and saw her face, and came directly to the table and sat down across from her. He didn't ask. He just waited. "She saw him," Clara said. Her voice was steady. "Dorothy Hale. She saw him twice through her kitchen window when he didn't know anyone was watching. She's been carrying it for 4 years. She set the letter down carefully. She says she never said anything because she didn't think it would do any good. She says she's sorry. Clara stopped. She says she'll testify. Hank put his hand on the table between them. Not on her hand. On the table close enough to be there if she wanted it. "1 witness, he said. 1 witness, plus Dr. Harrison's documentation, plus my own account, and an attorney who knows the territorial court." She looked at him. "It might be enough." "It's enough," he said, certain. The way he said things he'd decided. She looked at his hand on the table. Then she put her hand over his. They sat like that in the kitchen with the starter breathing on its shelf and the stove warming the room, and neither of them saying anything else because nothing else needed saying. The morning of the hearing, Clara put on the best dress she'd bought in Harlan Creek. Dark wool, well cut. Nothing apologetic about it. She braided her hair up and looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 2 months ago with $11 and bruises fading from purple to yellow and the folded weight of an advertisement that said, "No questions asked." She didn't look like that woman anymore. She looked like herself. Dottie appeared in the doorway while she was pinning her hair. "You look beautiful," Dottie said with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be strategic about compliments. "Thank you, sweetheart. Are you scared? A little? But you're a stayer. Dottie said it like a fact she had written in her book. So it doesn't matter if you're scared. Clara looked at her in the mirror. Come here. Dottie came and stood beside her, and Clara put both hands on her small shoulders and looked at her directly. Whatever happens today, she said, I want you to know that these 2 months have been the best 2 months I've had in a very long time. You and Ruthie and your papa, you gave me something back that I thought I'd lost for good. Dottie's chin went up. What did we give you? The belief that I was worth fighting for, Clara said. Dottie thought about this seriously. Then she wrapped both arms around Clara's waist and pressed her face against her side and held on, and Clara held her back, and they stayed like that until Ruthie called from downstairs that the wagon was ready and they were going to be late. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was a brick building that meant to impress and succeeded. Clara walked in with Hank on her left and Augustus Crane on her right, and Walt and Nell Pruitt behind her. Nell having announced the previous evening that she intended to attend as a character witness and would not be argued out of it. Gerald was already there. He was sitting at the plaintiff's table with Pritchard, which was the first surprise that Voss's lawyer was Gerald's lawyer, which confirmed what Clara had suspected about how Gerald had found her and who had pointed him toward Wyoming in the first place. She filed that information quietly and kept walking. Gerald looked at the people who walked in behind her, and she watched him count them and watched something shift in his posture. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Augustus Crane presented the chain of documentation, Dr. Harrison's records, Dorothy Hale's written statement, and a second letter that had arrived 2 days after the first from a physician in Boston who had treated Clara once for a broken rib and had recorded the cause as undetermined in his official records and had been living with that dishonesty for 3 years and had apparently found Dorothy Hale's courage contagious. 2 letters. 2 witnesses neither Gerald nor Pritchard had anticipated. Pritchard challenged both on procedural grounds. The judge, a territorial appointee named Hargrove, who had the quality of a man who had not been bought and was not for sale, listened to every challenge and denied them. Gerald testified. He was polished and controlled, and the story he told was internally consistent and completely false. And Clara sat at the respondent's table and listened to it and felt something cold and clarifying move through her because she had spent 3 years doubting her own memory of events. And she sat in this courtroom and listened to Gerald's version and knew with absolute certainty that her memory was correct and his was manufactured. Then she testified. She had rehearsed it with Augustus Crane 4 times. She knew the shape of what she needed to say and the order to say it in. But when she sat in the witness chair and the room went quiet and she looked out at the faces, Hank steady as bedrock, Nell sharp-eyed and certain, Walt holding his hat in his hands, and behind them 3 other people from Harlan Creek who had come because Nell had told them to something happened that she hadn't rehearsed. She stopped being afraid, not because the stakes had lowered. The stakes were exactly what they'd been. But she looked at those faces at the people who had put themselves in this room for her, and she understood in her bones what Dottie had said that morning, that being scared and being a stayer were not contradictory, that you could be terrified and still refuse to go anywhere. She told the truth, the whole truth plainly and without apology in the flat, factual language that Augustus Crane had coached her toward because facts were harder to dismiss than emotion, and she wanted this judge to have no room for dismissal. When she was done, the courtroom was quiet. Judge Hargrove asked Gerald 2 questions. The first was whether he could produce Dr. Sims for examination. Gerald said the doctor was unavailable due to a prior commitment in Boston. The second question was whether Gerald could explain the documented discrepancy between his claim that Clara had never sought medical treatment and the physician's record of a broken rib sustained in the marital home. Gerald's lawyer objected. The judge overruled the objection and waited. Gerald said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, the rib had been the result of a fall. Judge Hargrove looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his papers. I find insufficient evidence to support the claim of mental incompetence, he said. The petition is denied. The respondent is recognized as a woman of sound mind and independent legal standing in this territory. He set down his papers. Furthermore, I'm referring the matter of the fraudulently obtained Massachusetts court order to the Territorial Attorney General for review. He looked at Gerald directly. "Mr. Marsh, this court recommends you return to Boston and consult with your own legal counsel before pursuing any further action in this jurisdiction." Gerald sat at the plaintiff's table and said nothing. Pritchard put a hand on his arm and said something quietly. Clara stood up. Outside the courthouse in the cold October air, Nell Pruitt hugged her with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided a thing and was doing it regardless of whether she was generally a hugging sort of person. Walt shook her hand. Augustus Crane said he would file the paperwork by end of week, and she should hear final confirmation within a month. Then they were gone. Crane back to his office, Nell and Walt to find coffee, and it was just Hank. He was standing a few feet away, hat in his hands, looking at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to read precisely because it always meant more than she was ready to name. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "What's the other part?" He came toward her not quickly, the way Hank Calloway did. Everything with the deliberateness of a man who had decided something and was not going to be rushed about the execution. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face in the way he had that first day in the yard. That full, honest assessment, except it wasn't calculating anymore. It was something else entirely. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I've been trying to say it for about 3 weeks, and I keep finding reasons not to, which is not a habit I'm proud of." He turned the hat in his hands once, and then stopped turning it. "When Beth died, I decided that was it. That the part of my life that had warmth in it was finished, and the best I could do was run the ranch and keep the girls fed and not break anything else that mattered." He paused. "Then you stepped off that stagecoach and argued with me about the word baker, and cleaned my kitchen in 6 hours, and made my daughter eat her dinner, and found the deed that saved my land, and faced down your husband in my hallway without flinching, and I—" He stopped. "Hank, I'm in love with you," he said, plainly. No decoration on it. The way he said everything he actually meant. "I know that's not a simple thing to put on a person who just got free of a man who made love feel dangerous. I'm not asking you to answer it today or any particular day. I'm just telling you, because I think you deserve to know what's true. And I've been withholding the truth, and that's not something I'm willing to keep doing." Clara stood on the steps of the Cheyenne Territorial Courthouse and looked at Hank Calloway and thought about a woman who had arrived at a broken-down ranch with $11 and a last name that wasn't hers, who had been so thoroughly taught that she was too much, too big, too loud, too inconvenient, too present in every room she entered, that she had nearly believed it. She thought about Dottie writing true things in a book so she wouldn't lose them. She thought about Ruthie writing, "We are not leaving," in her sister's handwriting. She thought about bread, about how you couldn't force it, couldn't rush it, couldn't make it be something it wasn't. But if you showed up every day and did the work, and trusted the process, something honest came out of the oven. "I know it's not simple," she said. "I know I'm still sorting through what love is supposed to feel like when it doesn't hurt." She looked at him directly, at this plain, steady man who had called her magnificent, and meant it as a fact. "But I also know that every morning when I come into that kitchen, and you're already there drinking your coffee, standing up like sitting down might kill you, something in me settles. Like a thing that's been moving very fast for a long time, finally found the right speed." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "That's not nothing." She reached out and took the hat from his hands, which startled him enough that he almost laughed, and handed it back to him properly. "Put your hat on," she said. "We've got 3 hours back to Harlan Creek, and the girls have been with Walt's wife since morning, and Dottie is going to want a full account of everything. She's going to want to write it in her book," he said. "Every word," Clara agreed. He put his hat on. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the courthouse steps together into the cold, bright October afternoon. The ride back was mostly quiet, the comfortable kind, the kind that happened between people who had stopped performing ease and had arrived at the actual thing. The mountains were white-capped against a sky so clear it looked like it had been scrubbed. The road ran through dry grass that had gone gold in the autumn cold, and Clara sat on the wagon seat with Hank's shoulder solid against hers and watched Wyoming go past and felt without drama and without qualifier that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ranch came into view as the sun was getting low, the familiar cluster of buildings, the barn, the kitchen window already lit from inside where Walt's wife had probably started dinner, and two small figures running from the porch toward the wagon before it had fully stopped. Dottie hit Clara's side before Clara had fully climbed down, both arms around her waist, face buried in her coat. "Tell me everything," she said, muffled. "Tell me every single word." Ruthie stood back. She was trying to look composed and not entirely succeeding. "Well," she said. "It's over," Clara said. "He can't touch us." Ruthie's composed expression cracked just for a second, just enough, and then she put it back together and said, "Good," and helped bring in the supply bags from the wagon bed with the brisk efficiency of a girl who had learned to process relief through action. That night, Clara made bread. Not because it needed to be made, Walt's wife had already left a pot of stew on the stove, but because she needed her hands in dough, and she needed the smell of it baking, and she needed the starter to know it had passengers worth carrying. Dottie sat on her stool and wrote in her book. Ruthie did her sums at the table and pretended she wasn't listening to Clara tell Dottie about the courtroom and the judge, and the moment Gerald Marsh sat in his chair and said nothing. Hank sat at the head of the table with a cup of coffee and watched all of it with the expression of a man who had been given something back he thought he'd lost and was still getting used to the weight of it in his hands. "What happens now?" Dottie asked when the story was finished. "What do you mean?" Clara said. "I mean after all the problems are solved and the bad men are gone and the judge said the right thing." She looked at Clara with those dark, serious eyes. "What happens to us, to all of us?" Clara looked at Hank across the kitchen. He looked back at her. "We get up tomorrow," Clara said, "and we make breakfast. And then we do the next day and the next one after that. We fix the things that need fixing, and we build the things that need building, and we take care of each other." She set the bread in the oven and turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at this kitchen, this table, these people who had somehow become the truest thing in her life. That's what happens, everything ordinary and everything good. Dottie thought about this carefully. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote something in her book. "What did you write?" Ruthie asked. Dottie turned the book around so the whole table could see it. "We get to stay." Clara Bowman had arrived at the Callaway Ranch with nothing but a cast-iron skillet, $11, and the desperate arithmetic of a woman who had run out of road. She had expected to survive. She had not expected to be found, not by this place, not by these people, not by a version of herself. She had stopped believing still existed somewhere underneath everything Gerald Marsh had spent 3 years trying to bury. But survival had a way of revealing what was real if you let it. And what was real was this: a kitchen that smelled like bread and possibility. A man who said true things plainly and meant every word. 2 daughters who had written her name in a book of things they refused to lose, and a sourdough starter on a shelf that had kept breathing through every mile of a very long journey, because some things, once they find the right conditions, refuse to stop being alive. She had not come here looking for a home. She had found one anyway. And she was never for a single day of the rest of her life going to apologize for taking up every inch of it.